So, Project Deck. For anyone who is not aware already, this is a game that I have been working on off and on for the last like 15 years or so. It was an idea that I originally had way back when I was first really getting into D&D, as well as getting into trading card games and deck building games. Like at the time, it was specifically the WoW TCG I was playing. And I had this idea of what if these two things that I'm spending a bunch of time on, what if there was a way to sort of combine some of the best and most fun aspects of both of these. Since that started ages ago, I've thrown everything out multiple times at this point. There's been a lot of situations in which I kind of took what I had and I went, I don't like how this is going, and I threw it all out and I started again from scratch. So this is not 15 years worth of work that you're about to see today. It's more the current idea after 15 years worth of starting idea, getting something going, tossing all of that out, learning from what I built and then tossed out, and then starting something again with everything that I'd learned in mind. So the way we're going to go through this is I've got this presentation that we're going to go through. It's going to go over some of the basics of the game, some of how it's played, some of what it's about, and some of the core concepts, as well as a few of the systems that are in place for how the game actually works and comes together. Once we've gone through the basics of at least some of the basics of how it all comes together, we're going to do an intro to one of the classes that will be playable in the game. This specifically the Gambler class is the one that I've chosen. It has a few abilities that give a good example of different ways that the game lets you do different things with it. So we're going to talk about the Gambler class for a little bit, that the concept of the class is, and then I have several of the cards/abilities that will be available to the Gambler class that we'll go over, and we'll discuss those. After all of that, there will be time for Q&A. So if you're one of the people currently watching live on Twitch, we will have a section towards the end of this segment that will give time to go over any questions that you have. I will probably not be answering too many questions as I'm going through the presentation. So if you have questions and thoughts, maybe note them down and save them for that portion of the presentation towards the end. And if you are watching this after it's been live, if you're watching this on the VOD that's on YouTube, go ahead and leave a comment on YouTube, and I will try to answer as many questions as I can in those comments, or perhaps in a follow-up video later on, depending on the nature of everything that's going on with it. Last couple of notes, I guess, before we get started. Everything in here is very, very subject to change. Again, this is the current idea after having thrown out everything probably 6 or 7 times over the course of working on this thing. So this is the current idea, and this is the idea that I feel has the strongest basis. This is the one that's really starting, like everything's starting to click with this idea. So I'm excited about it. That's why I feel comfortable showing it off. But again, there's always the possibility that things change dramatically. There's several things that I will even call out throughout the presentation that I'm pretty sure are going to change. They're just sort of temporary placeholder stuff. Just a starting point, and then I'll refine it from there afterwards. This includes the name, by the way. The name Project Deck, that's just a placeholder, like project name. I've had a few different ideas for what the final name of the game might be. But I want to get the game kind of mostly complete before I settle on what I should actually call it, because that feels like a more sensible approach to everything. So, without further ado, let's get started. So first off, what is Project Deck? What actually even is this game, other than the meandering explanations I've given for it so far? So, the concept is essentially a tabletop RPG, like a Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, GURPS, etc., that sort of game, that it meets the concept of a deck building game, not a trading card game. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but the idea of deck building, where you have a deck of cards. In fact, each class has its own set of cards with its own rules. So each class is like a self-contained little set of cards that has certain abilities and cards that are available to it that aren't available to other classes, or if they are available, then it's only a small set of classes that would have them available to them. There's still a simplified character sheet and equipment, but I'm trying to keep that sheet to like a real small little size so you can just make little notes about what you need to, and keep most of your actions and your abilities to the cards themselves. So as you're playing a card, that's you taking an action and doing something and doing whatever it says on the card. There is still a DM. Part of me really wants to say that DM in this case stands for Deck Master, but that might be a little bit too cheeky even for me. So there's the concept of a DM. There's someone whose role it is to control the monsters and guide the party through an adventure of some kind. And there will be these pre-made adventure decks. We're not going to talk about these too much today, but the idea is that there is similar in concept to a module, like you might be able to get a hold of for another, like something like D&D or whatever. There's like a little pack that has monsters in it. It has scenarios. It has encounters in it. It can even have that includes non-combat stuff like meeting NPCs or interactions or puzzles, stuff like that, and also contains loot. And loot is another thing that I'm going to talk about at another time, because the method that I'm using for loot in this game is it's interesting. We'll get into that another time. But anyway, there's these pre-made adventure decks that are designed to be easily controlled by a novice DM. So if you're not somebody who has a ton of experience with world building, has a ton of experience with making things up on the fly, you do have this pack that you can it will have a module style setup where you can set it up and you can just go through it as its own like self-contained adventure, and you can lead your party through that, and everybody can have a fun time playing it. But those packs will also just naturally, as a result of having all these monsters, having all these scenarios, having all these puzzles and stuff that are available inside of them, they will give more advanced DMs the tools to be creative. You can even like mix and match from multiple adventure packs if you wanted to. But you can also, like, if there's just one that you're like, I like the theme of this one a lot, you can take that and then create your own adventure for your party using the tools that are available there. Think of that similarly to like reading the monster manual for D&D, where you now have the knowledge to use these encounters, and you can just be like, okay, this next encounter that you come across, it's these 5 cards that I've pre-selected. This is what you're fighting. This is what you're up against. That sort of approach. The cards and the card playing is mostly combat in this game. And that's kind of the idea of taking what would be miniatures and your grid and everything inside of a game like D&D, where you're moving things around, you're putting things in certain situations or certain positions, you're checking ranges and so on, and all of that. That's mostly handled by playing the cards. So you'll have the DM will have their list of enemies in front of you essentially, and then you as the players will have the ability to play cards to fight them. Many of these cards also have non-combat uses, so that's why it says cards are mostly combat. There will be cards that can have non-combat uses, and there's methodologies that I'm still refining just slightly on how to incorporate the non-combat cards into the overall deck, or at least the cards that have non-combat uses. There's some of that I still have to figure out exactly how I want to incorporate all that. But there will be cards that do have the ability to use outside of combat. Think of things like guidance, for example, from a D&D perspective. Yes, that's something that can be useful in combat, but it also has a lot of non-combat uses where you might use that immediately before trying to pick a lock or whatever. There are also plenty of non-combat actions that you can take without playing a card. And we're going to talk about some of those in a moment here as well. But the idea of having an ability that you can use and having stuff that you can do without necessarily having to play a card to do it is still something that is present and functional inside of this game. Moving on, so with all of this in mind, right? With all of what these basic understanding of what the game even is in mind, the next step for me was to sit back and be like, okay, what is core to this game? What are the most important 3 things about how this game is built that are going to really help solidify the identity of the game? And one of the first one is I want it to be approachable but deep. Part of the core of the concept initially in even developing this thing was that having like the idea of what if instead of having to flip through a spell book to figure out what my sorcerer can cast. I just had some cards, and each of those cards said what they're doing, and then I could just play whichever card seems like the most appropriate one to play in that moment. The idea of making it approachable in that sense by you always have a list of things in front of you that you're able to do, and it's easy to understand, and there's no like, did you read this set of rules that was in the player handbook that was on page 250 of that or whatever. Trying to keep everything relatively self-contained and relatively approachable in that sense, but at the same time allowing combinations of those things, very deck building game TCG style, where you say, oh, well, I have this card and I also have this card, and I look at these two cards and I realize, hey, if I play this one and then this one, something crazy can happen as a result. And again, we're going to have some examples of what that means later on in the presentation here. But I wanted it to be something that anybody could pick up and play and understand very easily, because again, you've got the rules for whatever it is you're trying to do right in front of you. And then as you go on, you can get deeper and deeper into it by understanding more of how, okay, I remember that this other ability exists. So if I use this one, maybe I can get that other one, and we can do something cool with that. Next set was, or the next core pillar is the concept that rules are made to be broken. One of the things that I enjoy the most about many deck building games and card games is that you have this sort of like basic set of rules, and then you have cards and abilities that let you violate those rules, let you break those rules, push beyond the limitations that you have there. So one of the core and most important things about this game is that, yes, we're going to have a set of rules and we're going to have a basic way that this game is played, but nobody is ever just playing that basic game. There is always some way that you can exceed those limitations. You can break outside of the box a little bit, and you can do that in different ways depending on different classes. And then the last core pillar that I wanted to make sure to bring up today is the concept of buy what you want. Now, there's a lot about the monetization and the way that this thing will be sold that I'll need to figure out much later on in development once I've figured out what the game is at first. But one core thing that I wanted to start with as I was developing things was the concept that this isn't going to be a TCG or CCG in the sense that you're not buying blind packs hoping to get the card that you need out of that. You're not like buying a whole bunch of these packs and then hoping that, ooh, maybe I finally got the fireball card or whatever, so now I can make this build that I've been wanting to make. There will always be a direct way to get whatever set of cards you're after without having to hope that you pull it from a pack, is basically what it boils down to. So for example, if we come out with a new class at some point in the future, you would be able to buy something that has all of the cards that are at least currently available for that class inside of it. And then the limitations then come from the cards themselves on which ones you can put in your deck and so on. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. This is not a game that is ever going to be something that, if you want to even be able to play or enjoy it from the beginning, you don't need to buy a whole bunch of blind packs and hope that you get the right cards. You can literally just be like, I want to play a gambler, so I bought the gambler pack, and now I have the gambler cards and I can play the gambler the same as anybody else can play the gambler. There is a possibility for exploring some of that sort of like chase pack, blind pack thing in the future. But if that's something that I ever do, it'll be purely cosmetic stuff. It'll just be like, these are fancier versions of the cards that you probably already have because you've bought the thing that gave you all those cards in the first place. And this is important because this means that I can design the game from the perspective of not needing to worry about, is this card just way too strong? And if nobody ever has this card, if somebody hasn't gotten this card, this class now sucks if you don't get this. You always have the option of using any of the cards that are available to any of the classes. Okay, so talking about some of these basic rules, this is the essentially the setup for the game. Your player deck is composed of 30 cards. So you'll have just a stack of 30 cards. That's your deck. That number may very well change at some point. It's just a starting point. But the concept there is to make sure that it is small enough that realistically, if you put a card that you're excited about in your deck, you will at some point draw that card. It's not such a massive deck that it's just lost in there somewhere and you haven't really gained anything. But it's still big enough that it doesn't feel so much like a set rotation. It's not like this list of 8 cards and you're just going to go through those 8 cards over and over and over and over and over again. You do still have that element of needing to be able to draw the cards that you want, so that way when you do draw that card that you're looking for, you're like, hey, this is cool. Now I can do this cool thing that I want to do. That also allows me to make some abilities that, again, are kind of wild and crazy, knowing that you won't be able to use them constantly. They'll just be something that you then have available, and maybe it sits in your hand for a little while until you find the right moment where you're like, yes, now I want to play this card and do something cool with it. Each class has a preset starting deck. So what that means is your 30 cards, when you start up your gambler, for example, there will be a list that says these are the 30 cards to put in your deck to start. And there will be a bunch of duplicates in there. There'll be a bunch of things that are essentially just basic attacks or just standard normal abilities. But you will have this deck of 30 cards that you're starting with. And then as you level up, you will be able to put different cards inside of that. And the way you do that is by actually replacing those cards as you're leveling up. So if you level up to level, I don't know, 3 or whatever, and you get access to this new card that you're like, yes, this is the card that I would like to choose to now put in my deck. You essentially take out one of the older cards that isn't as good as that card, and you put that new one in. You will play, again, in a normal situation, you would play 1 card or perform 1 basic action per turn. Again, basic actions being something that there's always a fallback if you don't have a card that you want to play. There's always something you can still do. This will alternate between the quote unquote DM and the party. And the party can go in any order that they like, but you have to fully resolve each player's turn before moving on. So there isn't like how you're sitting around the table is the order that you take actions in or anything like that. There isn't an initiative order. It's just, I say that there may be something that I do at some point to determine whether the DM or the party goes first. So that kind of an initiative sense, but as you're going through combat or you're going through whatever is going on, whatever scenario you're in, the DM will get their turn. They do everything that they're going to do. And then the party gets their turn and they do everything that they're going to do. The only limitation on the party is that when one player starts doing something, you have to fully resolve that player's turn before you go to somebody else. And that's just because of, that helps keep things a little bit locked in and limited in terms of how different cards are. That'll make a little bit more sense once we get a little bit later on in the presentation when I'm talking about things like interrupt cards, which we'll see here in a moment. And ideally, you are playing a card each turn. The basic actions are just a fallback. So things are built in such a way that you probably have a card you want to play each turn. There's probably something in your hand that's better than just doing a basic action. Those are just there in case you do look at your hand and you go, ugh, I really don't want to do any of these things. Instead, I'm going to just do a basic attack, or I'm just going to try to bluff somebody or something like that. But again, these are the basic rules, and rules are made to be broken. So this is the standard set for where our starting point is. Cards and abilities and so on, and just different ways that classes work. You will probably break some or all of these rules in some way or another throughout normal gameplay. This is to create the initial shell so that way the cards can do interesting stuff with it. Switching gears a little bit, we have the concept of ability scores, which in this game I'm calling pact scores for a reason that will become pretty apparent here in a moment. There are 4 scores. And every class uses all of these in different ways. There isn't like a fighter. Oh yeah, strength is your most important stat and you hate all the others. You don't need dexterity. You don't need wisdom as a fighter. There isn't anything like that with this. There might still be different pact scores that you prefer based on what your build is and based on how a class generally works. But you don't necessarily have a dump stat. There's always some use to each of these. And this is part of why I've slimmed it down to 4 ability scores so that each of them has its own way to shine and can be used in multiple different ways. So the first of these is power. Starts with a P. You may begin to see a trend here. Power is generally the concept of how effective your abilities, spells, and attacks are. So if you're doing something, how powerful is it? And this isn't just damage, to be clear. So this is Obviously, power would be like, oh, I'm swinging my sword. So how much damage does my sword do? That would come down to power. Things like I'm casting a fireball. How much damage does my fireball do? That would also come down to power because, again, it's how powerful you are with the class that you're playing. It's not necessarily a question of what are your physical attributes in that sense. But this can also include things like if you're a healer, how much power, how powerful is your healing, and so on. Power is a very important, like, just make whatever thing I'm doing do more of said thing sort of stat. Our next stat is accuracy. There's an A there. Funny how that's working out. And accuracy is the general thought of what is my chance to hit or miss. And I put miss in quotes here because this could also be something that is generally conceived as, well, you didn't aim wrong, but they dodged it or something. Like it's not necessarily a chance to, like, if you're a melee fighter and you're swinging a giant sword at someone who's 3 feet away from you, the chance of you straight up missing is not very high, but they could dodge it, they could avoid it, and so on. So accuracy covers that general chance of, am I going to hit this person? And in similar fashion, some classes will lean on this more than others. So if there's like a sharpshooter sniper sort of class, they would probably be able to do a lot of damage, but need to make decent accuracy rolls to be able to actually do that damage. Whereas somebody who is like, if there's someone who's using a flamethrower, you don't really need to worry about accuracy so much with a flamethrower. That will instead lean on some of the other stats a little bit more. And many of the defensive abilities that exist in the game are actually accuracy debuffs. They make it similar to that concept of accuracy might mean that they dodged as opposed to you hitting. So you might say, well, this class has the ability to just move very quickly and give themselves some sort of defensive ability in that regard. That would be something where it's actually a debuff on the opponent's accuracy. So they have more of a chance to quote unquote miss when you attack. Next stat, cunning, starts with a C. I think you understand now where I'm going with the whole pact score thing. Cunning is the general idea of learning, awareness, and other brain functions, like general thought and mind over other mind sort of stuff is where cunning comes in. This one has many, many non-combat uses. So it will have combat uses as well. It's not purely a non-combat stat. And there is one card that I'm going to show you guys for the gambler that does lean on cunning quite heavily. But a lot of times it'll be like, I'm going to try to convince this shopkeeper to lower their prices, or I'm going to try to convince this guard to let me out of this cell that I'm in, stuff like that. That would be a cunning roll. And as I mentioned that, all of these skills also cover skill checks. So I'll come back to that in a second. Actually, let's finish going through these scores. The other thing about cunning actually is that it increases your hand size as well. So it does sort of have that built-in natural combat effectiveness by making it so you can hold more cards in your hand, which means as you have more of your deck in your hand at any moment in time, you have more options available to you. And you're more likely to be able to pick out those big, powerful cards that you want to be able to use more often. So cunning is a very important stat, both for combat and non-combat uses. And then the last stat is toughness, and that's how we get our PACT. And toughness is the general concept of just how hard are you to beat down. So this determines things like HP. It'll determine things like other resistances. And different abilities can lean on this in different ways. So there might be abilities where it's like, okay, what I'm trying to do here is shrug off some damage. I took a hit and I'm trying to just ignore some of that hit that I just took. That would be an ability that relies on, or a card that relies on toughness. Like I was saying before, skill checks rely on these a lot. So instead of having a list of different abilities that all scale with different pact scores, it's usually just going to come down to, especially if you're not using a card or anything, you're just rolling a standard non-combat action. It'll come down to rolling one of these scores, sometimes as an opposing roll. So for example, if you're trying to outsmart someone, that might be an opposing cunning roll where you roll your cunning, and then the enemy or whoever you're trying to outsmart rolls their cunning, and whoever wins that roll, it's an opposing roll in that sense. Maybe if you're trying to break down a door, that could be something like power. If you fall down and you need to figure out how to stand up quickly after falling down, that could be a toughness roll to see if you're able to stand up and continue taking actions and so on. These are the general thoughts that I have in mind as I'm going through this. Again, a lot of this is subject to change, but the idea is that these scores like this are they're kind of the governing factors that allow for rolls to still happen in a meaningful way without necessarily needing a card for everything. But cards will lean on these as well. Next thing to cover in terms of basic design before we get into going through some of the actual abilities and examples of the way that the gambler class works. There are different special action types, and these are things that each card or ability will probably have, well, not always, but sometimes they will have one of these special action types attached to them, and that allows other cards and other abilities to work off of them in different ways. So the first is an attack. If an ability is an attack, then it will have the attack action type. And this can even be ranged, melee, or magic attack types. And those can be different, like mix and match as well. So something might be a ranged magic attack. Something might be a melee magic attack. Magic really is the one that kind of is the most grab bag on that. There might be this sort of thing. There's likely to be more of these as I continue developing the game. So there might be something I end up doing that's like, no, this is a physical attack. So there's that physical tag as well that other cards can interact with in the future. You can always basic attack. Every class always has the ability to just do a basic attack. So if you've ended up in a situation where your hand is full of cards, you don't want to get rid of any of these, but you still want to be able to attack in your turn, you can always just basic attack instead. And some cards and abilities, kind of like I was mentioning, especially defensive abilities, they will react specifically to attack actions. So there'll be cards that say when attacked or when an attack action is used, you can then do this thing. The next card type is ongoing. And this one is pretty straightforward, but this is a card that remains in play until it's removed. So it will have some sort of constant ongoing effect that you deal with whenever you do a certain thing or whenever someone else does a certain thing. It's something that just sits on the table in front of you and remains active until something removes it. And there can be cards that specifically remove ongoing effects, but there can also be most ongoing effects will have some sort of like when X happens, this is removed sort of thing. So it ends up being pretty straightforward, even if it sounds like it might be a little complicated. And then the last action type that I want to discuss today, because part of the reason I'm discussing these is because we're going to show some of these abilities here in a second. But the interrupt action type, these are playable at any time. They will usually have some sort of qualifying factor on them that says play this immediately after or when someone's about to do X or Y sort of thing. But you do not have to play these on your turn. These tend to be played outside of your turn. These can be combined with other action types. So you might have an interrupt attack. You might have an interrupt ongoing that says, like if you're being attacked, you play this interrupt and now you have additional armor for the next round or something like that. Or the armor, I don't even know if armor is going to be a thing, but you have additional attacks against you have lower accuracy for the next round or something like that. The sort of thing that sits there until then it gets taken away again. And the important thing about interrupts is that these resolve before whatever you're interrupting. So for the most part in this game, cards take place in the order that they're played. If you play a card, you resolve that card, and then someone else can play another card, and then you resolve that card, and so on and so forth. Interrupts are something that you play, and when someone else is about to do something, you play this card to say, "Nuh-uh, don't do that. We're doing this thing instead," or "I'm going to do this thing before you do that thing." I do have an interrupt card that we're going to show for the gambler here in a minute. In fact, let's get into that. So now that we have a lot of the basics and so on in place, let's talk a bit about the gambler and what this class is. And then we'll go through some of the abilities that they will have available, some of the cards that they will have available that kind of will hopefully help illustrate where I'm going with all of this like word salad that I've been throwing at you this whole time. So the concept of the gambler. This one is the idea for this really stemmed out of those like riverboat casino sort of like situations in your head. Like you think of characters that would maybe they hung out in New Orleans a whole lot back in the day. Very like Prohibition era, riverboat casino, that sort of thing. Uh, playing card games with a group of people that they got together and probably conning them out of money in the process. So a lot of their cards draw inspiration from popular gambling games and also cheating at said popular gambling games. A lot of these cards they sort of play around with that idea quite a bit. The Gambler is a class that's able to play multiple cards per turn quite regularly. There's a few different ways that will occur, but they are more than other classes, more than most other classes at the very least, able to regularly be putting down 2, 3, 4, etc. cards in a given hand or in a given turn. They also, as a result, have many cards that will play around with what's in your hand, what's in your deck, how are your dice rolls operating. They do a lot of like, I've got a hidden card up my sleeve, or I've got a loaded dice is one of the cards that we're going to show off here in a minute. That sense of like, this is a swindler in a sense. This is a character whose goal is to kind of cheat at things a little bit, which again helps really sell the notion of rules are meant to be broken. So let's look at one card. We'll look at this first card. This is a starter card. This card is Flick, is the name of the ability. It's a starter card, so that means that this card is in that list of 30 cards. There's a few of these actually in that list of 30 cards that you start your character off with when you're making a gambler. It's a ranged attack card. And the text on it is make a basic attack for each card you played since your last turn. So when you have a turn and you manage to play 2, 3, 4 cards since that turn occurs. So either in that turn, or maybe it's something that you played as an interrupt for somebody else during their turn. Each card that you played, you then get the ability to make a basic attack for each of those. So if you've managed to play 4 cards since your last turn, you now get to make 4 basic attacks by playing Flick. And so gamblers, their regular basic attack is relatively weak compared to most other classes. Flick is something that sort of props that up and lets you use it multiple times. Another important thing about this is that each basic attack that you use from Flick, it can be on a different target. So in a situation where maybe you have 3 different enemies that are attacking you, you can choose to put all 3 of those attacks into one target, or you can split them up and try to take out 3 different targets at the time. Next card. This is Full House. And I'm expecting this to be a level 2 to 4 card. The numbers on card levels are very rough right now. This is something that I'm still nailing down. And as I'm figuring out how I want to handle leveling in this game in general, it might change. So right now, consider this to be like a 1 to 5 scale. And then this card would fall somewhere in that 2 to 4 area, depending on what other cards I come up with and how the whole deck like fills together. But if possible, I'd love to avoid the like class level versus spell level thing that happens in D&D, where you're like, I'm a 12th level paladin and I have access to level 4 spells, and that just gets confusing. So this may end up changing. I may end up like increasing the scale on this quite a bit or something. I don't know, just to try and simplify that. It depends on how many levels I end up with wanting players to be able to achieve as well in the game. So we'll see how that goes. But for now, for purposes of this discussion and this presentation, this is something that would be in that level 2 to 4 radius if you assume that levels go from 1 to 5. This is also a ranged attack, and the text is, show your hand, make a basic attack for each unique card that you're holding. So it's playing a little bit fast and loose with the idea of what a full house is. Normally in poker, a full house is 2 of a kind and 3 of a kind. This is essentially saying you get to make a basic attack for each unique card that you're currently holding in your hand. But as a result, it has this sort of like kiss curse thing to it, where you can deal a lot of damage with this. If you've got 5 different cards in your hand, you get to make 5 different basic attacks. But now the DM knows what cards you have available, and they're able to use that knowledge to try and work against you a little bit. So they're able to say, okay, hold on, I know that you've got this other ability that you have in waiting, so I'm going to do this thing from this monster or this creature or this enemy to try and get you to bait out that card that I know you have so that I have safety to use it for later or something along those lines. Yeah, so there is that little bit of a downside in that you do have to show your entire hand to everyone, including the DM, which then means that the monsters can use that information. That said, it also has a natural scaling with increased hand size. So that cunning stat I was talking about earlier that has the effect of increasing your hand size, the number of cards that you can hold in your hand. If you get up to where you can hold maybe 6, 7, 8 cards in your hand, I don't know what the maximum on that is going to be yet, but if you're getting up to the point where you can hold that, now that's more cards in your hand that you have the ability to get basic attacks for. Next card, Loaded Dice. This one is probably going to fall around level 1 to 3, again on that 1 to 5 scale. And this is an interrupt. So this is one that needs to be played before and interrupts something that someone else is doing. So the text on this is you play this immediately before anyone is about to roll. You may add or subtract 1d6 from their final result. So if someone is about to attack you, you can play Loaded Dice and you can say that you're going to subtract 1d6 from whatever they roll in terms of damage or accuracy or whatever. If you are, maybe you're rolling for a basic attack that you just did, maybe even through a flick play that you just did, you can also play this to then increase the roll on whatever you're about to do yourself by 1d6. The important thing though is that this has to be done before the roll. You don't get to wait and see if you should have used this before the roll actually happens. You do have to use it before the roll, but it's still incredibly versatile, and it's the sort of card that I can see a lot of gamblers wanting to use quite regularly. Here's a card called Call the Bluff. This again is falling in that 1 to 3 range, and this is a ranged attack. And this is just a straight up attack that's based on cunning. It doesn't use power or accuracy at all. This is a outsmarting someone attack. So you roll cunning against your opponent. If you have a high enough cunning, then you are more likely to win this roll against a target with weaker cunning. Whoever has the lowest result takes 3d6 damage. So that 3d6 very well might change. I'm still figuring out what damage and HP numbers are going to end up looking like, because a lot of that determination will need to be made after I have a lot of the determinations of what the cards are and what the classes are already taken care of. But the idea is you roll cunning, and then there is a set-ish amount of dice that you roll to determine damage for the person with the lowest result. So again, this allows the gambler to use cunning to attack instead of necessarily only relying on accuracy or power. And then one other important note here is that packed score checks can be differently per class or creature. So maybe for the gambler, your cunning check might be 2d6 plus your cunning score. But then another class, maybe that would be 1d6 or 1d12 or something like that. Those can be different based on what the class or creature that you're rolling against actually has. So there's a lot of potential to be able to identify, okay, I'm rolling against a creature here that I know they have a low cunning roll. So I now have the ability to try and defeat them and do a whole bunch of damage based on the fact that I know that they have a lower cunning roll. Next card. This is our first ongoing card. This is called Roll the Bones. This is a level 1 to 3 card again. This is ongoing, like I said. So the text is roll 2d6 whenever dealing damage to an enemy target. If the result is 7 or 11, deal twice as much damage. If the result is 2, 3, or 12, remove this. So this is basically adding a sort of craps style mini game to the gambler, where when you're about to do some damage, you get to roll 2 6-sided die, and much like in craps, if you get a 7 or 11, at least on the first roll in craps, if you get a 7 or 11, that's a good thing. If you get a 2, 3, or 12, that's a bad thing. The 7 or 11 means you deal twice as much damage. 2, 3, or 12 means that you take roll the bones out. You discard that. You no longer have them roll the bones active. If you roll anything else, if you roll like a 6 or an 8 or a 9 or whatever, then nothing happens. That's just congratulations. Your roll the bones didn't proc this time, essentially. But this gives you like a buff essentially that you can put on yourself that allows you to have a chance to do a bit of extra damage whenever you're dealing damage. And you're just kind of hoping that you get those 7s and 11s more than you get 2s, 3s, or 12s. I am also considering a higher level version of this card that works on the whole party, so that you start a game, and the kit and the theme at least would be that you start a game, and that the whole party gets the option of playing along with this. But I have to figure out exactly how I would want to implement that. Next card. I have, I think, 3 more cards. Yeah, this card and then 2 more. So this is two of a kind. Again, in that 1 to 3 range is where this would end up. And by the way, these ranges, just in case it wasn't clear, this means that I think it will be one of these, not that it is a 1 to 3 level card. It's either a 1 or a 2 or a 3, but I have to make the rest of the cards to figure out where it's going to be. This is just a standard action, just a regular action. You may play this immediately after playing any other card. You then perform that card's action a second time. So even though it's a regular action and it's not an interrupt, you still have, because the text says you can play this immediately after playing any other card. So that works on interrupts. So if you decide to play, where'd it go? Loaded dice, where you add or subtract 1d6 from the final result, you could play loaded dice and then play 2 of a kind, and you perform that action a second time. So you're actually now getting 2 uses of loaded dice instead of just 1. You could theoretically play this immediately after playing Roll the Bones, so that now you have 2 rolls each time, and only one or the other gets removed. Which also means that balancing this might be very, very tricky. This might end up, like, the 2 of a kind might end up getting moved to a higher level position as a result. But it's another way that, like, technically this is another card that you'd be playing. So if you imagine you played like a regular attack, maybe you played full house at the start of your last turn, and then somebody rolled and played you played loaded dice on that, and then you played 2 of a kind on your loaded dice, for example, or maybe you played 2 of a kind on your full house. You've now played 3 cards since your last turn, so that means you can do a flick on your next turn, and you get 3 basic attacks as a result of that. 2 more cards to go through, and these ones follow kind of a theme. The first is called When to Hold 'em. This is going to be a higher level card in that level 3 to 5 range. And it's just a regular action. But this one lets you draw additional cards up to twice your hand size. So if your hand size is 5, you get to draw cards up to 10 in your hand, and you have 10 cards in your hand. Now, you still won't be able to draw more cards until you're back under your hand size limit. So if your hand size is only 5, you will need to play cards or discard cards. There's a method to just be like, I don't want this anymore, get this out of my hand, and then you have to take a basic action instead. You will be able to then have more cards in your hand as a result. This also means that you have the opportunity now, if you have 10 cards in your hand or 12 cards in your hand, however many it is, you then have the ability to have more cards to play, so that you can then do a flick on your next turn. And that basic, like, level 0 card essentially now turns into a ton of damage, because you played 6 cards in your last turn. So now you're doing 6 basic attacks as a result. And then the sort of similar themed card to go with When to Hold 'em is When to Fold 'em, as you might expect. And this card, the text is, it's the same level, the same about level. It's just a regular action, but this card allows you to discard your entire hand and draw a new one. And you may then choose to shuffle your discard pile into your draw pile. So normally, you play through your deck, you draw your cards, and you don't reshuffle until either a card that you play tells you to reshuffle, or you've gone through your whole deck. You then get to reshuffle your discard pile back into your hand. Kind of plays that way. So this means that you can say, okay, I've already played all of my best cards. I just have When to Fold them here. So I'm going to play When to Fold them. I'm going to discard my entire hand. I'm then going to draw a new hand. You do draw the new hand first. But then I'm going to reshuffle my discard pile into my draw pile, so that way the the really cool card that I just played a second ago is back and available to be drawn again, and I don't have to wait until I go through my entire deck. Or maybe you haven't drawn that card yet, and you're looking at your hand. And you say, the only thing I have in here that I really care about is When to Fold'em. So I'm just going to play When to Fold'em, and I'm going to draw a new hand. This will let me get through my draw pile a little bit faster, and maybe I'll get that card sooner. But you don't have to reshuffle immediately after playing this card. You can use this to be like, I've only drawn crap so far, so let me play this, get rid of what's in my hand, draw a new hand, and then be able to move on from there. So those are the cards that I wanted to show off, and hopefully that gives some idea of what this class is and how it plays. Imagine other cards along these lines and along these themes. There's going to be a few more cards that are just straight up regular attacks. There will be a lot more like basic stuff, things that scale with power and accuracy, even some things that scale with toughness. There will be more defensive abilities. Like I'm imagining cards along the lines of being able to look at your top few cards in your deck and choose one of those that you're going to play. Being able to deny an action from from an enemy or something like that. Excuse me, or something like that. Lots of different ways that could go. But hopefully this gives some idea of what the gambler class is and how they will play. So what's next? I just have a few little call outs here for how you can help. If you're watching this, or maybe you're one of the people who's here live on Twitch right now, or you're watching this on YouTube, what are some things you can do to help make this game exist? Hopefully the bits of talking about it that I've done here are exciting and you're enjoying them. You're enjoying where my head's at with this whole thing. I think this has the potential to be a really fun game. Here's ways they can help. One big one is just subscribe on YouTube. I will be having updates coming out from time to time on YouTube when I am making like big strides forward or pushing this thing to the next step of the development. That will be where information comes out. You can also join my Patreon. I will be including updates on development of Project Deck in the monthly content update videos that I produce for Patreon going forward. So if you want to get all the nitty gritty details of what I've been working on, where things are, and what the next steps are for me in terms of developing the game, joining my Patreon is the best way to do that. That also helps support me financially so that I have more time that I can spend on actually developing the game and getting it done. So that's a big one as well. And then just honestly keeping an eye out for future announcements. Like there's going to be more stuff that I have to say about this. So keep an eye out, tell your friends, like pass around, let's share this video to people and be like, hey, look at this game this guy's making. Maybe it's cool. Right now, the biggest thing that I need for this is honestly just momentum in getting it rolling and getting it started towards being able to be something cool. So the more people are paying attention to updates that I give for it, the more people that are joining the Patreon so that I can afford to spend the time working on it. That's the biggest stuff that can happen right now. And of course, if you are in the industry in some capacity, maybe you produce and create card games already, and you're like, hey, that's a pretty interesting idea. Or maybe you're somebody that knows a lot about how the process of putting all this together, because I'm just kind of doing this myself right now and figuring it out as I go. So if you are in the industry specifically, especially the tabletop and card game industry, you can send me an email. That's devilore@gmail.com is my business email. So you can go ahead and send me an email if you want to get in touch, and we can talk more about what we can do going forward and how the game can come together. But with that, we will now go into some Q&A. So anyone who's watching throughout that presentation, if you have any questions, please do feel free to shout them out. I'll give you guys just a second to maybe get any of those questions in. But if there's anything you would like to know about this game, I will try to answer to the best of my ability. Obviously, there's a lot that I'm still figuring out. There's a lot that I may just not have an answer to yet. But if there's any questions that you have about the game, maybe types of classes that there's going to be, ways that the actual drawing and discarding and playing the each turn goes, anything along those lines, please feel free to shout them out. Sounds super fun and a great concept so far. Not a question, but we're saying, well, hey, I appreciate it. I appreciate that a lot. Let me drink some water here real quick, and then we'll get to some questions. How many different classes do you expect to have? So, like I said at the start of the presentation, one of the core concepts is buy what you need. You don't need to worry about, am I going to buy a pack and then I have to like keep continuing to try to get one of those good cards so that I can make this build. And so part of what I'm thinking about with that is that we will have like there'll probably be like a starter pack that contains an adventure deck and then a few classes in it, probably 4 to 5 classes inside that pack. And that'll be just something that you can, as a group of people, maybe you pool in, you get this together. I'm not expecting it to be super expensive or anything. Or maybe it's like, hey, I'm really excited about this and I want to be able to play this with my friends. So I bought this starter pack and there's a few different classes, again, probably 4 or 5 classes in there, and an adventure deck so you can get started. Beyond that, it will be an ongoing thing. So if I have an idea for a cool class that I'm like, yeah, I really want to make a class that's along these lines, we can keep going and keep going and keep going. And they will be meant to be they're all self-contained. So I don't ever have to worry about like, oh, we made this class and now that made this other class way too strong. Unless there's like a buff or something, but we can be careful about that. So we can keep making classes. My goal, like I said, for like launch of this is to have, goal is probably about 6 classes to have for the launch of this, but then that would be something where I then immediately have follow-up plans for another 3 or 4 classes that would be developed and released over the year or so after that. And then those follow-up classes that are released would be something that you can just buy on its own for a much lower price. Question: can power but low accuracy result in a negative effect? Like a person with high power using a flamethrower, but with low accuracy, they did hit and set their target on fire, but also set everything else on fire. That's a really fun idea. Yeah. And part of the concept for design for this is to allow wacky and crazy stuff to happen. So maybe there's like that flamethrower idea, or maybe if I have or whenever I get around to having like a magic mage sort of class, maybe I can really lean into the meme of fireballing your party, where it's like, maybe it's called spontaneous fireball, or I'm blanking on the word for difficult to control right now, but the sort of thing where it's like, yeah, you fireballed and yeah, it hit all the enemies, but you rolled low enough on accuracy that it also hit you and your party members too, sort of thing. So yeah, there's lots of different ways that the scores can result in that. And part of the idea too with the way that the packed scores actually work is to allow for players to be like, okay, I'm gonna use accuracy as my dump stat, and I'm going to exclusively focus on putting cards and abilities in my deck that don't rely on accuracy, because I want to focus on high power, high cunning, or high toughness or something like that, and not have to worry about hitting so much because my abilities always hit. Or you could then also have that same class and someone would say, okay, but I like this ability that requires accuracy, and I like this ability that requires accuracy, so I'm going to focus on accuracy instead and use something else as the quote unquote dump stat in that regard. I may have missed it, but is your goal for this to be PvP oriented, PvE, or options for both? So the starting concept is this is a tabletop RPG at its core. This is still very much D&D style, where you have a DM, you have an adventure, and you have a cooperative storytelling experience that you're going through, where the DM is presenting this world to you. Either it's one that came from an adventure deck as a prepackaged thing, or it's something that they came up with themselves and they're leading you through this adventure of their own creation. So it's very much a tabletop RPG in that sense. So the core of the game is still very much that it should be a PvE game. There's a possibility, depending on how things shake out, that a PvP or dueling method of this game could still very much work. A lot of the ways that I'm designing in the mentally, like, a lot of the considerations that I'm making for how creatures and monsters will work, make them operate very similar to players in some senses, just in a lot of a much more stripped down, easier to digest sort of fashion, so that you're not like each monster, like every kobold doesn't have its own entire player deck essentially that you come across. But the result should hopefully be that dueling another player becomes an option. And it is something where you can sit there and be like, okay, let's just have a duel and we'll go head to head against each other, like Magic the Gathering style in that sense. That is a secondary, like, if I can do it, then we'll do that goal. It's not the primary goal of the game though. So it will depend. Like, my goal is first and foremost, make it a fun and enjoyable tabletop RPG. And then if there is a way to turn that into something that has these dueling rules associated with it, then I can add that on as like as a fun side thing. Or maybe that could be something that's like an expansion to the game later on or something like that. Lots of different ways that could go. May have missed it, but are all the cards class specific? Yes. So that's a great question that I'm glad you asked, because it's something that I kind of wanted to talk about and I didn't get to in the presentation. So one of the goals for this game is that everything is self-contained. You don't end up in a case where you say, okay, I'm playing this card, and in terms of playing this card, I'm now giving it to another player, and then they put it in their deck, and then they went home and brought their deck with them, and now I don't have that card anymore. Like that is something that I want to avoid completely from ever happening. That also means that things like loot and gear and items that you acquire and just general inventory stuff, that's part of why I still have the character sheet, is because that your character sheet will handle all of that. You're not receiving a card that is a healing potion that then sits in you're like, oh, thank you so much, DM, for giving me this healing potion card. And then that player goes home and now your DM is out a healing potion card. They may draw a card that says this player receives the healing potion, but then they just write that down on their character sheet and they move on. And then the majority of, if not all of the cards that you have in each of your class decks are then specific to that class, because you just have, you have it sitting in front of you. You have your own deck. Every other player will have their own deck as well. And you're pulling cards from that deck and you're playing them, and then they go back in your own deck afterwards. There is a possibility that I end up with some actions or some cards that are shared between a small number of classes. So like, hypothetically speaking, if there was to be a paladin spec or paladin class, and a priest class, and then I wanted something that was akin to divine inspiration, that might be an ability that both of those classes had available, but it would be in a case where there might be subtle differences for the paladin and the priest, which, by the way, neither of those are classes that I'm planning to make off the top of my head right now. I want to get much more like into the minutia with each class than the more broad sort of things. I might talk about that in a second. Anyway, there might be this version of a spell or a version of a ability that exists for multiple classes with subtle variations to it depending on the class. And then the rest of that sentence, sorry, that went away from me there for a second. But that would be something that is, it's only if it's a card and a concept for a card that makes sense for multiple classes, I might have a version of that that's available to multiple classes. But for the most part, yes, all of the cards are class specific. And again, if you're watching this on YouTube for the VOD afterwards, go ahead and leave questions in the comments, and I will either answer them directly in the comments, or maybe I'll make a follow-up video at some point as much as possible. Are all players always playing different classes, or could you have two gamblers in the same game? You could have two in the same game. Yeah, I don't see a reason. Okay, well, I'll say TBD. Ultimately, it will depend a lot on where things shake out with everything, but I don't see a reason with how things are coming together right now to disallow that and to say, no, you have to have all different classes inside of your game. It would mean that you'd need to get a second copy of the gambler deck, for example. So if you have two gamblers, you do need to have two gambler decks, because they're going to need to each be able to play their own cards and so on. But I don't see a reason to disallow that. So if you have maybe there's a bunch of groups of people that you all know, you're all playing this game, and you've bought a few different things and so on, and you have two people that are showing up for the game one night and they both want to play the same class, that's fine. I don't see a reason to disallow that. Theoretically, then, there could be cards that interact with a shared class, like casting a pyroblast by combining fireballs, or two gamblers hedging their bets. There could, in theory. I don't know that I would make cards that specifically encourage you to have two of the exact same class. But like if we go back to the loaded dice here, for example, there might be situations where you think to yourself, oh, this is advantageous to be able to play this multiple times and then be able to have that as multiple classes, or multiple of the same class is the rest of that thought. Plans for artwork. So the plans are to eventually get to a point where I'm gonna go back to this slide here. The plans are to eventually get to the point where I would be able to put together like some sort of crowdfunding or Kickstarter or something along those lines. And a significant portion of that would be to contract artists to create original artwork for the game. I'm not sure as of yet. Like I still have to figure out what the actual cards are going to look like and what the shape of them is going to be. So I'm not sure how prominently artwork will be featured on the cards, but they will have artwork on them, almost certainly in some capacity. It'll depend a lot, honestly, on how much I can afford to actually produce and actually pay people for. I am not going to use AI artwork, if that's the underlying part of the question there. There's no plans to use AI to produce any art for this whatsoever. It would be if I'm putting art on all the cards, I want to pay an artist to create art for all of said cards. But that's kind of where we're at the moment for that. The plans for artwork need to somewhat scale based on how much I can afford to pay said artists. So it may end up being the case that only some cards have art. It may end up being the case that only like there's art in like there will be like a little pamphlet, a little book that explains what's going on. Yeah. Add classes or different adventures later as expansions. Yeah, absolutely. Like that's pretty much exactly the plan. Is there would be like a starter pack that has a bunch of stuff in it to get started, but theoretically all of the things in that pack would also be individually sold. So if you just like, well, I want to play the Gambler, I don't want to buy another starter pack to have a second Gambler pack, so I'm just going to buy a Gambler. Or we all, as our group of friends, all happen to already own these other classes, so we don't need to buy a whole starter pack to get the adventure that comes in the starter pack. You would then be able to buy the adventure pack instead. And then as time goes on, I would just be releasing more and more, like, here's a new class, here's a new adventure, here's a new class, here's a new adventure. Possibly even the concept of revisiting some earlier classes and being like, here's an expansion pack for that class that now gives them some new cards to rotate into your abilities and so on. That's kind of the general idea. I still have a lot to figure out in terms of the monetization model and how I would want to do that, but that's kind of where I'm going with all of it. We decided if this will be digital, physical, or both. I'm designing this from the core of it being a physical game. This is a tabletop game that you get your friends together and you play in front of them. That is the concept. That's just how the concept has existed from the beginning. Obviously, a lot of things have changed about the world in the last 5 years to the point where I know that there is probably going to be an even higher demand for it to be digital. I'm designing it from the perspective of being a physical game with the hope that I can figure out how to do a digital version of it, if that makes sense. Because I know a lot of people, like, I'm in multiple tabletop campaigns and we're doing all of those online. We're not doing any of those in person right now. So I want it to be able to be a physical game, but there's the possibility of some sort of digital thing for it. Producing a digital game is a even larger undertaking than producing a physical game, as I understand it. So I don't know, maybe there's a whole bunch of stuff about producing a physical game that I'm not thinking of, but the idea is starting from it as a physical game and then hopefully branching off into digital in the future. Or who knows? Maybe what'll happen is people get really excited about this, and I'll have a Kickstarter that goes crazy, and then we will be we'll be able to afford to put a studio together and produce it as a digital title as well. I do want there to be a physical version of the game though. Length of a round, preference on how long or range. That's something that I think we'll have to figure out in playtesting. We'll have to figure out how good it feels, and how things are feeling. I will say that, like, again, this is a tabletop RPG, so it's I would think of it more in session concept than necessarily like, hey, let's sit down and play a game of Project Deck. It's like, well, no, we have a game of Project Deck that we play over and over again on like every week or every 2 weeks or however long you meet together with your friends to play it. But it's the same like campaign, the same ongoing flow over time. Obviously, coming down to things like modules and like if you have an adventure deck, how long should it take you to get through this adventure? That'll be the sort of thing that I want to get some playtesting in and figure out, like, is it something where it's okay for an adventure to take multiple sessions to get through? Or is this something that is like maybe about 2 hours max to get through this whole session and then you can do something else with your time, sort of stuff. But yeah, it is a tabletop RPG first and foremost. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks so much, everybody who has been hanging out here live in the Twitch stream. And thanks so much, everybody who's watching on YouTube for hanging out. Again, please do leave any questions that you have on YouTube, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. But hopefully this has explained quite a bit what this thing that I'm working on is. And hopefully it's made you excited about it, as excited about it as I am to be producing this thing. So yeah, thanks so much, everybody.